On Primetime Politics, planning for retaliation. Iran launches a missile attack hours after Israel begins a ground offensive in Lebanon. Coming up, we'll get reaction from the Israeli ambassador to Canada and ask how Israel will respond to this salvo from Tehran. Also,
there's nothing to negotiate.
The Bloc Québécois pushes its bill to extend old age security, a bill that has a greater chance of passing now that Liberals are looking for allies in the Commons. But can the public purse afford the extension? We'll speak to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux. And
making life more affordable for Saskatchewan people. It's part of our plan.
The writ is dropped in Saskatchewan. This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Air raid sirens sounded across Israel today as Iran launched a missile attack. Take a look at this video provided by the Israel Defense Forces. It shows the country's Iron Dome holding back many of those missiles. Now, Iran's missile launch does come just hours after Israel invaded southern Lebanon, a ground offensive which the IDF describes as limited and localized, specifically targeting the terrorist group Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran. Take a listen now to what we heard from the Foreign Affairs Minister in reaction here in Ottawa.
We've all seen the attacks by Iran against Israel, and we condemn them unequivocally. These attacks from Iran will only serve to further destabilize the region, and it must stop.
Well, for some reaction to what has happened these last few hours, we're now joined by Israel's ambassador to Canada, Iddo Moed. Ambassador Moed, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So let's begin with your reaction. You know, you and I are talking just after Iran has launched this missile salvo against Israel. Your thoughts on that?
It's just unprecedented number of missiles shot by a country into Israel, sovereign country, indiscriminately into civilian populations all around Israel. If you look at the map that's published for the public to know where to expect those missiles to hit, it covers all of the center of Israel. And this is a war crime in itself. But what Iran is actually unleashing right now is beyond using all its proxies, attacking Israel directly with a clear aim to wipe Israel off the map. That's the stated target and goal by the leaders of the Iranian regime. And so it's unprecedented, and Israel will react to this. This is something that we, of course, cannot let by. No country in the world will allow this to happen, such a barrage of missiles, and we'll deal with that when the time comes.
Although we are already hearing from Tehran saying that if Israel retaliates for this action tonight, that the retribution will be even greater. Does that at all concern you?
We are in a war, and Iran started this war. Iran built a network of proxies around Israel with a very clear target to wipe Israel off the map. Iran is out there, the Iranian regime is out there to destroy the state of Israel. So there is no sort of a tit for tat here. It is very clear. They are the ones who are intent on destroying Israel. We have nothing against the Iranian people. They want to destroy the state of Israel as is. So when they armed and directed and financed and trained those proxies all around Israel, that was with the same goal. Now they do it directly. So they will fire those missiles. They have the intention to do that anyway, whatever Israel does, whether we defend ourselves or we don't. But we will not allow this to happen. And we call on the international community to take action together with Israel and to stand with Israel at this time, because this is not just about Israel. As we know, Iran's reach is far beyond the region. Their missile program reaches far into Europe. Their cyber and covert activities are taking place also in this part of the world. And so we have to be aware that Iran is a threat to global security.
Well, to that, when you talk about proxies, of course, one of them is Hezbollah, which is part of the so-called Iranian axis of resistance. Does the missile attack today affect in any way the ground offensive and what Israel is engaging in right now in southern Lebanon?
First of all, this axis of there's no resistance here. That's an axis of destruction. They are the ones who want to destroy a sovereign state off the face of the earth. That's their intention. So when they use their proxies in Lebanon, Hezbollah, we just have to remind ourselves, started to shoot into Israel on October the 8th just to support the Hamas in the south. So they've unleashed thousands of rockets, 8,000 to 9,000 rockets, even before the last wave, when Israel decided to go to the next level to stop it. They've destroyed homes. They've killed 48 people. They've killed 12 children playing soccer. And so that kind of indiscriminate attacks against Israel are very clear. They all have the same goal, the same aim, and that is to destroy the state of Israel. So yes, the war in Lebanon is one part, and the war in Gaza is one part. And in all of that, all of us forget one very important thing. 101 hostages are still being held in the tunnels in Gaza. And that those people have to come home. Hamas have to lay down their arms, Hezbollah have to lay down their arms, and Iran have to stay back, because the world must not accept that.
Except that when it comes to southern Lebanon, Israel, the IDF, has clearly stated that what their intention here is meant to be limited and targeted and isolated. So how far will the military operation go in Lebanon?
As far as is necessary to allow for the inhabitants of the northern part of Israel to go back to their homes. So if you can imagine the topography of the southern part of Lebanon, the borderline with Israel, there is a mountain ridge that overlooks into Israel. That's where Nasrallah and Khamenei and others stood to look into Israel when they prepared and planned their attacks. There is a ridge which is filled with Iranian bunkers and missile depots and so on. And this is our aim, to make sure that when this area is vacated, it's a strip of land of about 10 kilometers to the north of Israel's border with Lebanon that needs to be empty from any kind of arms and militias and terrorists, of course. The only ones who are allowed there are the United Nations Peacekeeping Corps and the Lebanese Army. And there is a Security Council resolution. Actually, there are two, 1701 and 1559. Both of them aim to make sure that that situation is created on the ground. But since they were drafted and agreed on by the United Nations Security Council, they were never fully implemented. And the whole world knows that. I mean, these reports were coming to the Security Council every few months, again and again. So we have to take that action to make sure that Hezbollah cannot threaten the inhabitants of the northern part of Israel, who some of them live almost on the border, and they left that area. 60,000 of them are still living somewhere around Israel, but not in their homes. Some of their homes were destroyed. Some of their plants were destroyed, their livelihood and so on. So all that needs to be changed so that they can go back and live in peace along the border, just as the inhabitants of the southern part of Lebanon.
But how do you ensure that there is no backlash from Hezbollah and Hamas after these military operations? Will Israel occupy these territories, or are you looking to the United Nations to establish missions to create a safety zone for Israel?
We know that Hamas and Hezbollah must be disarmed. They must be neutralized. They must disappear. Both of these terrorist organizations have only one stated goal. Hamas call it the liberation from the river to the sea, and Hezbollah calls it the liberation of Jerusalem. They both have the same aim. So both of these terrorist organizations must cease to exist. That's very clear. How this will take place, it is clear that there is a need for the international community to step in, for the government of Lebanon to step in and to take responsibility for its own territory. But until that happens, Israel will have to take care of its security in the best way it sees fit. And so we'll have to see that. But of course, we are asking for the international community to support us, to de-radicalize and to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, and to make sure that the Security Council resolutions are implemented in the southern part of Lebanon. And that's the role of the international community, the United Nations, the countries in the region, all of those who are seeking peace and security, and understand that only by standing together we'll be able to mitigate the threat that is not just to Israel, but actually to the whole world.
Now, the fear is expressed many times by different players all around the world. The fear of what is happening right now is that it will devolve into a wider war. Is that a fear, or is that a foregone conclusion at this point, that it will be a wider war?
Well, the threat is there. It's not, I wish I could say that it will disappear tomorrow, but Iran's intentions are very clear. And they say we have more missiles and we'll use more missiles. So the threat definitely exist. It will only be eliminated if the international community steps in as a whole and take a strong position against Iran. I'll give you an example. Canada designated the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization under criminal law. This has happened just recently in June, and that's a breakthrough for the international community's approach to the IRGC. Up until then, it was just the United States and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So Canada joined and made a very important step here, and I think that other countries should follow suit with Canada, and more sanctions should be implemented and more pressure should be exerted on Iran so that they will stand back from this horrendous, destructive agenda that they have. The people of Iran are suffering as well. They are not getting access to whatever development and prosperity they could have if their regime would have invested in their development. And so there is something that is very significant when we are talking about the threat from Iran, not just for the Middle East, but also for the rest of the world, because as I said, we've seen evidence, and I think much of it was also published here in Canada about their influence in campuses, universities, and the destructive role that they're trying to play here as well in society.
So that's the macro, but in the immediate, it is guaranteed that Israel will respond to what happened today.
We will respond at the time and the place of our choosing, but of course something that of that magnitude, a salvo of that magnitude is not something that in our part of the neighborhood, in our part of the world can go as if, just brush it off and say, well, okay, well, we'll live with that. No. Fortunately, very fortunately, our air defense and our population are behaving in such a way that very few people got hurt and most of the missiles were intercepted. But this is on our side. On the Iranian side, I think the Iranian regime must get a very, very, very clear message. This is not a path to pursue. This should never happen and should have never happened, and this must never happen again.
Ambassador, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Well, let's get to the domestic agenda here at home, as the Bloc Québécois had its first chance of this session to set the parliamentary agenda. Today, asking members from all parties to support their private members' bill, C-319.
And this is not, for us, an electoral debate. We have been saying that for years, and now comes the opportunity to do the right thing. And I believe that everybody should say, yes, this is an opportunity to do the right thing.
If passed, this bill would increase old age security benefits for Canadians over the age of 64, extending an earlier government move that increased the benefit for those over the age of 74. Also, it is one of two motions the Bloc Québécois says the government must adopt in order to keep the party's support. The motion tabled today will be voted on tomorrow, and it reads as follows. The House calls upon the government to take the necessary steps to ensure that a royal recommendation is granted as soon as possible to Bill C-319, an act to amend old age security. And also important to note that royal recommendation is key here, as bills involving public spending require a royal recommendation that can only be obtained by the government and presented by a minister in the Commons. So, with more on all this, we're now joined by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux. Mr. Giroux, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So, as we talk about this extension of OAS, let's talk a bit of the numbers here, because the Bloc Québécois, they peg it at around $12 billion for the first 5 years, $3 billion every year afterwards, but you estimate the cost will actually be higher. Just how much higher?
About $4 billion higher, and it's because it's $3 billion in the first year of the implementation, and we estimated that in May 2023, progressively rising to $3.5 billion after or during the fifth year, and it keeps on increasing after due to inflation and also population growth in that segment of the population, those aged 65 to 74.
So what does that do then? If the cost is higher, and again, this is driven by demographics, as you say, Canada's population is aging. Mm-hmm. So if this is driven by demographics, what does that do to the financial guardrails as defined by this government? Because they're not talking about a balanced budget. They're talking about keeping within a certain percentage. What does that potential increase do to that challenge?
And that's the interesting question for the government, notably. As you pointed out, the government has fiscal guardrails, one of which is to have a deficit that's no higher than 1% of GDP, so a deficit that's no higher than 1% of the size of the economy by 26-27. In the last budget, the government itself, based on its projections, was at 0.9, so very close to the 1% threshold they said they wouldn't cross. So if the government proceeds with enrichments to the old age security, there is a significant, very significant risk that they'll cross that threshold, so that the deficit will be higher than 1% of GDP in 26-27, which would lead the government with difficult choices. So either they try to limit the cost of this, but then that wouldn't be Bill C-319, or they increase taxes, or they reduce expenditures in other areas. But we know that there are other areas of pressures, notably increasing spending on defense to get closer to the NATO target of 2%. So this is probably a real conundrum for the Minister of Finance, finance officials, and the government as a whole, because of these fiscal anchors that the government has committed to and the cost of this measure.
And I guess it becomes a value judgment then, right? I mean, do you make cuts elsewhere in order to allow this to happen? Do you increase taxes, as you say? Do you ignore your guardrails already? Which one is more acceptable to the Canadian public? And I guess that's a quandary that the government will be left with if they actually go ahead with this extension.
Exactly. Other fiscal guardrails included a deficit no higher than $40 billion. And that's also at risk, depending what the implementation date would be for such a measure, and a declining debt to GDP ratio, which could also be postponed if the government proceeds with the enrichments to old age security.
Enrichments, as you say, let's talk a bit more about that, because it's not as if OAS doesn't exist. It exists for people who are in need. There's already an extension given to people 75 and older, and that's basically trying to guarantee that people who may have run out of their savings don't have $0 in their bank account, right? So there's already a percentage of government spending meant to secure seniors in this country. Just in terms of a dollar figure, what are we looking at here?
For individual seniors who are eligible for the OAS, it's $718 a month currently. And for those 75 and over, it's $790 per month. So there's a $72 difference between these two, so 10%. And in terms of overall spending, we're talking well in excess of $60 billion per year, rising to $80 billion per year in a few years because of the inflation and population growth.
So 80 billion out of what, about $500 billion in spending?
Yeah, roughly speaking. Slightly less these days, but soon we'll cross that threshold.
Okay, so that's the percentages you're dealing with, but as you say, as much as there's a benefit cash-wise if this goes through, there's also going to be a reckoning as to how you actually pay for that. That said then, in terms of demographics, if we can go back very quickly there, you know, we're approaching the end now of the baby boom cohort. People that are approaching retirement, born in 1964 is the end of the baby boomers. And according to StatsCan, we are approaching a point where by the middle of this century, really just about 25 years from now, 1 in 4 Canadians will be a senior citizen. Can the public purse actually afford such an extension for OAS?
That's a very good question. Strictly speaking, we probably can, but it also means that the government will have to make choices. So the government, if it goes ahead with this, will be hard-pressed or will have choices to make if it also wants to extend dental care and increase spending on national defense, for example, or enrich other programs. So we can, but we can probably not do everything that the public is calling on the government to do, while also not increasing taxes or reducing expenditures in other areas.
Good to know the options ahead of us. Yves Giroux, thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.
Well, time now for a look at what happened in politics today.
Yeas pour 121, 121. Nays contre 207, 207.
Je déclare la motion.
I declare the motion defeated.
Mr. Kazan.
The government survived another non-confidence vote today, the second to be brought forward by Conservatives this fall. And it failed along the same lines as their first attempt last week, with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois both voting with the Liberal government. But the Bloc has made it clear if two of their party's private members' bills do not become law by October 29, the Liberals will lose BQ support. Now, one of those bills from the Bloc proposes a 10% top-up to old age security payments for seniors between the ages of 65 and 74. That bill, C-319, was debated in the House of Commons today. The Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates the top-up could cost $16 billion over 5 years. But Bloc leader Yves Blanchette says money can be redirected from elsewhere, including funds earmarked for oil and gas. On the Hill, the flag of residential school survivors was raised today during a ceremony. The orange flag honors the children who never returned home from residential schools, and it acknowledges the trauma inflicted on survivors and their families. And finally tonight, a historic day in Mexico as that country inaugurates its first female president. Claudia Sheinbaum, who was elected in a landslide back in June, was sworn in today. Sheinbaum is a former mayor of Mexico City and a climate scientist. Well, to Saskatchewan now, where the writ has dropped and early polls say it will be a tight provincial race. Scott Moe, the incumbent and leader of the Saskatchewan Party, using this first day of the campaign to promise lower income taxes for people in Saskatchewan, while the Saskatchewan NDP leader Carla Beck is promising to improve healthcare, education, and the provincial economy. Election day in the province is October the 28th. Well, with more on the Saskatchewan campaign, we're now joined by Murray Mandrake, columnist with the Regina Leader-Post. Murray, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Listen, going into this campaign, the numbers suggest that things will be this will be a tight race, rather, for both Scott Moe and Carla Beck. Very briefly with each of them, what does each leader face in terms of a challenge going into this campaign?
Tighter, and the challenge for is really the record for both of them, except it's a different challenge. The Premier has to account for his own 6-year record since becoming Premier, taking over from Brad Wall, and a lagging economy, healthcare, education problems pre, post, and during the pandemic. The NDP leader, Carla Beck, is the 5th consecutive Saskatchewan leader in 5 consecutive elections. So even though she's been around for about a decade as an elected MLA, there's a huge problem in Saskatchewan with familiarity related to the NDP leader. And that's coupled with the fact that this is not the traditional NDP province it once was under the Tommy Douglas, Roy Roanoel, and Blakeney years. This has become a very conservative province, not unlike Alberta in terms of its viewpoint on several issues. And I think that'll be the largest challenge for the NDP right now, is overcoming the notion that they are similar to the federal NDP or other NDP parties across the country.
Mm-hmm. So distinguishing themselves, as you say. But there's also a Saskatchewan United Party. What role will that party play in all this, do you think?
Well, that might be interesting because they have 3 candidates right now that are former Saskatchewan Party MLAs, disenchanted, that are running for them in various ridings. Now, no one is expecting them to have a huge impact, because where they happen to be running, mostly in rural Saskatchewan ridings, in the case of one former Saskatchewan Party MLA on the suburban riding in southeast Saskatoon, there might be a little bit more impact, but the Sask Party is so strong in rural Saskatchewan. They won every rural Saskatchewan seats last election. There's been redistribution, but they won every Saskatchewan seat last election by at least a margin of 35%. There was no other party that got 35% in the last election. It would be rather phenomenal if the NDP had a breakthrough in rural Saskatchewan anywhere, much like the situation is in Alberta. However, there is a fair bit of disenchantment in in Saskatchewan, and some of that is being expressed on the right as opposed to the left through the Saskatchewan Party. So you're hearing similar issues that you are hearing in Alberta related to people related to the Freedom Convoy, to other issues that are now being talked about a little bit more that the actual campaign is on.
Disenchantment, as you say, but it was interesting because to listen to Scott Moe as well as the NDP leader today, both were actually talking about affordability. So is that the ballot box issue for the vast majority of people in Saskatchewan?
Well, it's a strange province in the sense that there's always quirky issues that are really off the page, but there's always the meat and potato issues. And this is a very pragmatic province in which there's a lot of just standard issues of trying to get by. It's obviously a rural-based province, a province where we're dependent on natural resources. So as such, issues like the carbon tax, what people are paying for things like gas and home heating become an immediate issue. And as you well know, Premier Scott Moe has been in a pitched battle with Ottawa over the carbon tax being charged on natural gas after it was charged on oil home heating, or after it was removed on oil home heating in Atlantic Canada mostly, although it was moved across the country, it was mostly Atlantic provinces that benefited. And he hasn't let Saskatchewan people forget that. In essence, he's running against Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, and the federal government. And he's trying very hard to link the federal NDP to the federal conservatives, and obviously the provincial NDP is the linkage that he is running against in this particular election. And he's running this on the economic issues related to the people's affordability, the economy as such, and obviously talking already a little bit about more income tax reductions, and noting that he did remove or pay for the carbon tax on natural gas home heating, which is the bulk of home heating in Saskatchewan.
Well, it's just begun, and we're watching very closely from here in Ottawa. Murray, thank you for this. Hopefully we'll speak again in the course of this campaign.
Very, very welcome at any time.
And that is the program for this Tuesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow. Until then, take care.